Welcome to Module 4, Plant Water Requirement. Now, this is the foundational concept for irrigation science, and we will get with it right away. All right, so, and I'm actually going to pull the book up so that I have it in front of me and I don't miss any of the concepts that are really important for us going forward. All right, so here's the thing. Irrigation, when we talk about water in a landscape, irrigation and rainwater, we talk about it in inches or cubic feet. So inches of water applied, inches of water removed, inches of water captured, inches of water stored in soil. It's always in inches of water or cubic feet of water. And so essentially what we're doing is we're taking area out of our conversation. Area, in other words, how many square feet are we covering with this particular plant, isn't really discussed except in precipitation rate. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. But right now, just to understand how water is moving through soil, we're going to be sticking in inches or cubic feet of water only. And so this plant water requirement is about determining how much water in this place, in this particular place, does a plant require? And so there are a lot of things that would affect that, right? It's the plant water requirement is going to be different for different locations, right? If you're in Massachusetts, different plant water requirement from someone in Kansas or from Colorado. You get it. Or even down the block, different from what my experience is, what my plants require. If I have different plants, they're going to require different amounts of water. If I have soils that are different, that's going to create a difference in the amount of water required. Or maybe I have a different way of delivering the water to the plants. That is going to change the amount of water the plants require. So we are going to start with the very most basic idea of how much water a plant requires, and we're going to build up and start to add on other aspects to it. So the first thing that we are going to ask ourselves is, in this place, in this particular place, how much water does my plant require? And that's going to depend on where you live. So what this is asking you to do is observe where you live as closely as possible and get clues about the macro environment, the macro climate. And fortunately, we have a lot of tools that we can use in order to help us to define our macro climate. But it starts with observation. And what we want to do is we want to imagine that we're we're trying to do a search on the computer, right? So we want to create, in order to determine where we live, we want to create metrics or things that we can use, like, well, how much rain, that defines where we are, or how many cold days, or how many hot days, or what is the evapotranspiration rate. Okay, so that is what we're going to hone in on. So, what we're asking ourselves essentially is, where are we? Where are we? And how do we define where we are? Are we here? In this place, there's 200 inches of precipitation. It's in rain. It comes sort of throughout the year. That's a different place from this. This place, doesn't get that much precipitation. It doesn't come throughout the year. It comes at certain times of the year. Or how about here? This is where our cool season turf grass comes from, right? Whether you have it in Massachusetts or California, it's essentially a plant that is endemic to this place. And in this place, they get 45 inches of precipitation a year in the summertime. So is that the environment that you have for your cool season grass? Or is this the way grass looks really in your environment? where maybe you only get winter rain instead of getting that summer rain. And so, of course, the plant material is going to look different. So differences in climate have to be measured in a bunch of different ways. And so it's not just about precipitation, but precipitation is one that we're used to thinking about. For example, this is desert, but it's a different desert than you would find, on the eastern side of the Rockies. Okay, same desert climate, but different. And it's different not just because of the amount of rain that it gets, but also because of the timing of when the rain comes. Also, whether it gets snow or not, like that might be a form of precipitation. And whether the temperature extremes are they're going to be different, whether it's a coastal desert or an inland desert. And so, and geography is going to affect this greatly. Like, is this, is your place, not just talking about desert, but is your place adjacent to a mountain? Is it in a basin? Is it at the coast? So all of these things are going to affect what we are going to call macroclimate. And we need to figure out a way to describe our macroclimate, again, as I said, as though you were just, using a search engine. So yes, these are all things that we can use to describe our macroclimate. And boy, that's a huge search. If I wanted to describe Los Angeles, and I had to describe it by saying, well, let's see, it's a place with average annual rainfall of 10 inches a year. The rainfall happens in the winter time. It doesn't usually get snow. It has windy season in the fall. The coastal areas get fog during the spring. If you had to describe it that way, it would be very challenging. So the way that we are going to start to describe the climate, the macroclimate, is through something called evapotranspiration. Now, evapotranspiration is a measurement of the amount of water that is lost or taken, really, from the soil and transferred into the atmosphere through evaporation. That would be a lost from the soil to the atmosphere, and transpiration, which is managed by a plant. So it's the amount of water that is evaporated and transpired from the soil to the atmosphere over a period of time. And it's measured in inches. So it's inches per day, inches per week, inches per month, inches per year. Now, I just want to be clear that we understand what transpiration is. So transpiration is basically like plant sweat. So this is a plant in a particular place is reacting to solar radiation. So when the sun is out, there are going to be some plants that react by being sweaty because they need to take the water out of the soil and put it into the atmosphere in order to cool themselves down. They are, we call these high evapotranspiration plants or high ET plants. And I'm going to stop using the word evapotranspiration every sentence. It's going to be ET from now on. Okay, I'm not talking about extraterrestrials, all right? ET, evapotranspiration. So the sweaty plant is one that has to remove water, a lot of water from the soil, and not just a lot of water, but a lot of water over a short period of time from the soil into the atmosphere to cool itself down. Sweaty plant, high ET. At the same time, in our environments, we have plants that are adapted to dealing with the solar radiation, and they are not sweaty. They're totally chill. They have all kinds of adaptations like leathery leaves or small leaves or hairy silver leaves, or and your particular, your plant palette will have particular adaptations, but those are examples of them. And because they have those adaptations, they are not as sweaty. They are not taking as much water over the same period of time to cool themselves off. They're like, hey, I'm chill. So we call these the low ET plants, low evapotranspiration plants. And in your landscape, you're going to have plants of both kinds. But here's the thing. how do you figure out, how does that still help us? Because as I said, in your landscape, you have plants that have different evapotranspiration rates. So a system has been developed by it's an agricultural system actually, and it was originally created for calculating the evapotranspiration of alfalfa. And there are some other key plants, but alfalfa is pretty much the universal, and I do mean worldwide, baseline plant for calculating evapotranspiration for agricultural systems. But when turfgrass became an agricultural product, and really our biggest agricultural product, or one of the biggest, a new evapotranspiration system, a new measurement of evapotranspiration was developed specifically for turfgrass. So this is cool season fescue, and cool season fescue has become the baseline plant, like the benchmark plant against which all other plants are measured, and it's the plant that can be used to figure out what is evapotranspiration in this place. So this baseline plant is planted all over the country, and weather stations like this are placed on top of it. And those weather stations are measuring all of those conditions that we talked about earlier, the rain, the rain, the sun, intensity, wind, all that stuff, and measuring the amount of water that this plant, that this cool season fescue in this place is taking out of the soil and putting into the atmosphere. How much is this particular plant evapotranspiring? And when you have a base mark, a baseline plant like that planted in all these different places, and they're all being measured exactly the same, you can begin to infer information about that place by looking at that evapotranspiration rate, right? Because a plant, if it's the same plant and it's planted near the beach, for example, and it's evapotranspiring at this particular rate, but then inland, it's evapotranspiring at a totally different rate, you can begin to make inferences about, well, what are the climates like? Because it's the same plant, right? Now, that is this measure of evapotranspiration is called the reference evapotranspiration rate. I said I wasn't going to say it. The reference ET rate, or ETO. ET observed. It's the baseline reference evapotranspiration rate, and it tells you what your macroclimate is. Now, cool season turfgrass, cool season fescue, grown in a particular place with all the same conditions, can be described by ETO. And so what we are saying essentially, and I kind of want you to start to say it in your own mind when you are thinking about ETO. Okay, what you're saying is, when you see ETO, and in this case, this is annual ETO of 46 inches. Okay, and where did I get that from? It's random. It's going to be different everywhere in the country. It is different. Every landscape almost, it's different, but we narrow it down to like climate zones. Okay, but every climate zone ETO is different. Okay, I picked 46 inches. What does that mean? What does 46 inches mean? It means that in this place where this plant is grown, cool season turfgrass requires 46 inches of water per year to be healthy if it's maintained at 4 to 7 inches in height in an open field. So there's no influence of buildings or trees or anything, and adequately irrigated. So it's being given enough water, so that it's not stressed, for optimum growth. So 4 to 7 inches a year, an open field, and adequately irrigated for optimum growth. When this plant is grown in that way, in this place, it requires 46 inches of water a year. That means that over the course of the year, this plant has removed from the soil 46 inches of water and put it up into the atmosphere. And eventually, we are going to have to figure out a way to get that water back into the soil through irrigation. We're going to start with irrigation. Okay, so annual ETO or ETO, ET observed is the ET, evapotranspiration of the reference plant. The reference plant is cool season fescue, turf grass. It is maintained 4 to 7 inches a year. It is grown in an open field with no trees or buildings, and it's adequately irrigated for optimum growth. How do we find ETO? Well, there are a lot of ways to do that. If you are in an agricultural state, you probably have more than others in order to do this. The EPA does have, the EPA WaterSense site does have a water budget data finder that will help you to determine what the ETO of a particular place is in the highest ETO month, and that's going to be July. So or maybe it's not always July. In some places it's August, some places it's June, but it'll give you the highest ETO. And we'll talk more about monthly ETO and so forth in a second, but you can find this data here. There's a link in the course material. If you live in California, you can, or if you live in California, and even if you live in arid West and know that your particular climate is similar to a climate in California, you could utilize this system called the California Irrigation Management Information System, or CIMIS. And you can go on to this site and you can find out ETO data in real detail. I mean, it actually gets very specific. And we're going to use this data for our sample exercises. But understand that almost every state has something like this to use. And if not, you can use the EPA WaterSense site. So let me just make sure I'm following along with the book. Okay, yes. All right. So remember, ETO is describing a particular place. Now we're going to go through an exercise which is going to help you to start to use this data and sort of intuit how the information would be used. So if I asked you, well, what's the relevant ETO in Orange County, California? Or in any place, but Orange County, California. You might go to the CIMIS website and you would pull down this reference evapotranspiration map. This map is in your course materials. And oh, sorry. So you would look at this map and you would then hone in, well, where's Orange County? Where's Orange County in California? Okay, it's in the lower southwest corner of California. And you can see there that if I just hone in on Orange County, there are a bunch of different colors that are being used to indicate ETO, ETO zones. So in Orange County, there's this kind of like green zone and there's this kind of purple zone. And notice that the purple zone is along the coast. So that's interesting. And then this kind of green zone, greenish-y zone is a little bit further inland. And so if you utilize the map, and again, in the slide, it's a little fuzzy, but the course materials have this actual map and you can see it clearly. So you can see here when we're honing in on Orange County, there are a bunch of different zones. So we have even like a number 2 there, which I didn't see at first on the screen. And then we have a number 4. And then we have something that looks like it's number 6. And so each of these is going to be a particular evapotranspiration zone. If you look at the map, you can see that 2 would be the coastal mixed fog area. So that's right on the coast, and it's got, you know, coastal mixed fog. Number 4 is going to be the South Coast inland plains. And number 6 is going to be the upland Central Coast and Los Angeles Basin. So each of these is a different, you know, type of zone. And there's going to be information that you can gather about these particular zones. So once you hone in on, you know, where you are, then you're going to be going to the actual evapotranspiration map or chart rather, and reading how much, what is the evapotranspiration. So that's what we're going to do next, is figure out how we actually read this. So if I ask the question, what is the relevant ETO zone for Santa Barbara, California? Now it starts to get a little bit more complex because we actually have like 4 zones in here. We have a 10, we have a 4, and we have Santa Barbara, the city, down here, but we have Santa Barbara County, which doesn't even really reflect what's going on in Santa Barbara, the city. So clearly, when we read the descriptions of the various ETO zones, we realize, wow, the coastal regions are completely different. You know, they're going to be described by this like number 1, number 3, number 4. But as you move inland, now this is a different story. That's going to be like a number 6, a number 10. And so you're going to be like trying to figure out, okay, which one best describes my area? And it's not perfect, but it gets you there. And once you figure out what your relevant ETO zone is, then you can look at the chart and you can actually see, okay, this information is being presented as ETO monthly. So what is monthly ETO? Monthly ETO is a measure in inches of the amount of water that the reference plant, remember, cool season grass grown 4 to 7 inches tall in an open field and adequately irrigated, that particular plant grown in this particular climate zone on a monthly basis is taking this many inches of water out of the soil and putting it into the atmosphere. And so if we look, you know, we go to that chart and we look at, let's say, this is in this exercise, we look for Santa Ana, we would see that Santa Ana is going to be the upland Central Coast and Los Angeles Basin, so number 6. And so if we, let me see here. So if we look through here on number 6 and we come to July, we see that the July ETO for Santa Ana is 6.51 inches. So in Santa Ana, in July, cool season turf grass grown 4 to 7 inches in an open field and adequately irrigated requires or is removing from the soil 6.51 inches of water. Okay, and then when we go to Santa Barbara and we find we're in a different climate zone, we go to July, then we see that in July in Santa Barbara, cool season grass grown 4 to 7 inches in height, open field, adequately irrigated, requires only 5.89 inches of water for the month. So in these 2 places, we have completely different ETOs. Why do you think they're different? Well, one, Santa Ana is inland, so that's going to be a, you know, hotter climate. It's going to have I don't know, more radiant heat, all that stuff. At the beach, I've got fog. I don't have as much solar radiation as I do when I move inland. And so the plants that are growing, or this reference plant that's grown closer to the beach in Santa Barbara, it isn't going to require as much water because it doesn't have as many sunny days. It has more overcast days. It has more foggy days. When you go inland, you have sunshine all the time, and you have these other factors like wind and so forth. But solar radiation is the thing that really drives evapotranspiration. And I just thought of something. It's worth mentioning that evapotranspiration can be thought of as reverse rain, right? It's the water coming out of soil and going into the atmosphere. So that's why we talk about it in inches. And and it really is driven by solar radiation. So the longer the days, the sunnier the place, the more evapotranspiration is going to occur in that place. All right, so on the CIMMYS system, you can actually make reports, and I know that most agricultural states, this is something that you can do. You can create these reports. We're going to work through some of these just to get familiar with using this data and feeling comfortable describing what that data means. So here we've created a report that has a bunch of different cities and places in it, and different regions. And I'm going to hone in on Irvine. So the question is, in Irvine, what does this look like? And I'm actually going to, kind of pull it down. So I'm just looking at Irvine data. Okay, this is a South Coast Valley. It's it's like near the beach, but a little bit inland. And now we're just looking purely at the data, okay? Because this could be anywhere, but this is the particular thing. So the weather station in this place gave us this data for each month of the year, this ETO data. Question: what does the 49.63 represent? Well, that is the annual ETO in Irvine, the average annual ETO. So if we say it to ourselves, in Irvine, for 1 year, cool season grass grown in an open field with adequate irrigation maintained at 4 to 7 inches requires 49.63 inches of water over that year. Now, does it require all that water at one time? No. It requires different amounts of water at different times of the year. Now, why would that be? Well, if solar radiation is the thing that really drives evapotranspiration, you can imagine that in the summer months, when the days are long and the sun is high in the sky, we are going to have more evapotranspiration than we do in the months when there might be some overcast and certainly the days are shorter. So because solar radiation really drives evapotranspiration, we begin to see a curve. And that means that although for the year, it might be 49.63 inches, if we look at the highest part of the year in the summertime, and in this case in July, we are only evapotranspirating 6.29 inches in July. But then if we go to January, which in California, this is going to be, of course, well, everywhere, this is the short day, and it's probably a lot of overcast, maybe even some rain. And so in January, that same plant in the same place only requires 2.18 inches of water a year. So by looking at this monthly evapotranspiration map, can you begin to see that there's a bell curve happening, with the summer being the high point of the bell curve? That's when evapotranspiration is at its highest. And then as the days get shorter or are short, and we also have other influences, like we may be in a snow area, right? If we're in a snow area, we're not evapotranspiring, okay? So what happens is the curve falls off in the fall and in the winter, and then in the spring, it's still pretty low because the days are short, but then it begins to ramp up again in the summertime. So if I ask you, what does 6.29 mean? That is telling us that in Irvine, in July, cool season grass, 4 to 7 inches, open field, adequately irrigated, requires 6.29 inches of water in the month of July. Okay. All right, so this annual and monthly ETO is valuable data. But for irrigation, we don't talk about irrigation like, okay, how much water am I going to apply this year? That might be relevant down the line when we're talking about, water budgeting or whatever. But in terms of actually applying water only when it's needed, it doesn't really help us because we need to know like what's happening every hour or something, but certainly we need to know every day, how much water is actually evapotranspiring every day. And so now that we have an annual number, and even better, we have a monthly number, we can begin to figure out how many inches of water are required in the on a particular day in a particular month. So to determine daily ETO, which is really the number that we want to kind of get to, we just divide whatever our data is by the relevant days in the period. So if we are only given an annual number like 49.63, and we have to figure out daily ETO, and that's the only number we've been given, yeah, you divide by 365. Is it right? Probably not, because, ETO has a bell curve. So it's not going to be, evapotranspiring the same amount in December as it is in July, but it's a good number to get you there. Okay. Kind of underestimates the summer and a little bit overestimates the winter, but it's all right. It gets you there. It gets you in the ballpark. Better yet, you've been able to establish an ETO for either the highest month of the year, because you can infer things about other months from that, or you've gotten information from the particular month that you're dealing with. And when you get the information from the particular month, you divide it by the number of days in the month in order to determine the daily ETO. So if I had 6.29 inches of water in, that's actually July, and I wanted to know daily, let's see, 30 days has September, April, June, November, all the rest of 31, except for February. So 31 days. So I would divide 6.29 by 31 to determine the daily ETO. All right, that's ETO. That is the cool season grass. That is the baseline grass for our irrigation, right? This is the one that allows us to determine essentially what I call macroclimate. This describes where we are. Now, the question that we are going to have to add to this is, well, yeah, okay, that gets us into a macro area, but my particular garden is a little different from the macro area. I mean, I have things happening in my garden that are, that are going to affect how much water the plants require in my garden. So we like to think about ETO as being, so that's what we were just talking about. We like to think about that as asking ourselves the question, where are we? If we just landed in this landscape, the first question we might say is, well, where are we? How do we describe where we are? ETO, that describes where we are. But then we're going to ask ourselves, well, what's there in the landscape? What things in this landscape need or apply water? Well, certainly the plants need water. And if we have an irrigation system, that applies water. And both of the things that are there in the landscape are going to adjust our ETO. They're going to adjust our macroclimate and really kind of bring it down to this particular landscape. So if our landscape is not the reference plant and perfectly irrigated, then we are going to have to use some way to adjust ETO to come up with a plant water requirement for my particular plant in the landscape. And so we're going to adjust ETO. And there are two key ETO adjustment factors that we're going to use. The first one describes the plants in the environment, and the second one describes the irrigation system. So the first one that we're going to work with is the plant factor. So plant factor is an ETO adjustment factor that describes the particular plant that's in the landscape. So what we mean by that, when I say describes it and adjusts ETO, like what do you mean? Well, essentially, plant factor is going to be a percentage of ETO that adjusts it so that it describes the water need of the plant in the landscape. And this is, again, assuming that this particular plant is getting an adequate water supply, that there are no other microclimate things affecting it. It's not against a hot wall. It's not under a tree. You know, it's like in an open field, this particular plant now. And it's in my climate zone. How much water, how would I describe this particular plant, comparing it to the cool season grass? I know how much water the cool season grass in this place evapotranspires. I don't know how much water this plant evapotranspires, but I can start to make a guess if I know, how much water does it need relevant to the ETO. In other words, does it need the same amount of water? Does it need half the water? Is it a low water use plant? In other words, it only is going to require maybe 20% of the water. Like, how does it evapotranspire compared to the cool season grass? And so we are going to determine whether it is a high, moderate, low, or very low water requiring plant in comparison to cool season grass. And then we are going to assign a percentage in order that reflects that water need in order to adjust ETO to come up with the amount of water this plant needs. So again, there are sources for figuring out the percentage that you would apply given your assessment of whether the plant is high, moderate, low, or very low. And the Water Sense budget tool has a tool that indicates plant factors, and you can see that the plant factors are shown as 20% or 0.2, which is 20%, is low, medium is 50%, and high is 90% for trees, the type trees. So a tree that is a moderate, well, let's start with high. A tree that is a high water need tree is going to require 90% of the water that the ETO reference plant, cool season grass, requires in this place. Okay, if cool season grass requires 10 inches of water, a high water use tree would require 9 inches of water in the same time, because it's 90% of the water the cool season grass requires. And if we look here at ground covers that are low water requiring, they only require 20% of the water that cool season grass does. So again, if my ETO in this place for cool season grass is 10 inches, a ground cover in the same place that is a low water use ground cover is only going to require 2 inches of water. over the same time frame, because it's 20% of the ETO. So this water budget is also in the course material. You can go there to get information. If you're in California or any place that is growing California plants, you can utilize the WWLP database. Everything in California has got a weird acronym. Water Use Classification of Landscape Species. And that will give you information about it. It's an art and a science. We are not going to spend a lot of time on this because it's actually been supplanted by another way of evaluating it. But if you really want to get into the weeds of things, you can utilize the WWLP database and begin to find your ETO area. So let's say, again, remember we were talking about Irvine before. If you're in Irvine, you would take your ETO and that would put you in the South Coastal WWLP region, and then you would utilize the data from the South WWLP region. Anyway, you don't need to do this. This art and science thing is over, because what we are all doing is we are switching to what's called the slide method of determining the plant factor. So the slide method essentially was a study that was done, I think, at the University of California, Riverside. And what they did was they took many plants and they did a regression analysis of the plant factors and the actual actual evapotranspiration from those plants in different places. And what they found out is that, yeah, it's not so different, from, going inland or to the beach. It's like, it isn't really, the plant factor doesn't change. And the plant factor isn't really so different among forms of plants. So trees and shrubs kind of have the same plant factors, and ground covers have a similar plant factor to shrubs as well. So after they did all this regression, and believe me, when this first came out, we thought, in our view, this took away the expertise of landscape designers and landscape architects for understanding how plants worked in a particular environment, and it took away all that art that was associated with determining plant factors. But after using it for a couple of years, I realized, yeah, actually, first of all, it's a lot easier, and also, even though they call it irrigation science, and that implies that there is a very particular one answer for something, yeah, no, it is just as much art in all the other stuff that we're going to do. You're going to find rounding and all kinds of stuff that we're going to do in determining how much water a plant is going to get from an irrigation system, that just give up fighting about whether it's high, medium, or low. It's very helpful to use that information for when you're talking to people who are trying to manage the landscape, or when you're talking to like a layperson, a property owner who doesn't really have any background in irrigation or in a landscape. It's great to help them to understand how much water a plant needs by comparing plants high, medium, low against cool season grass. But when we're doing it for irrigation science, or for figuring out how much water a landscape needs, we don't need to go through all that rigmarole. We're going to use the slide method. So the slide method has basically broken down plants according to their form mostly, and a little bit of other information, and has assigned ETO adjustment factors, plant factors, to those forms for each month of the year. And so you can see, and by the way, this is now an ANSI standard. So what this basically allowed to happen is that now this is a universal certainly nationwide and Canada. So it's a North American standard for evaluating plants in a particular landscape. So that's another reason that we're relying on it. Anyway, in order to read this, what you're seeing here is that there are different types of plant categories. I'm going to skip all the sports field stuff, which you can understand would be at the top of the list. And I'm going to go down into the annual flowers, ground covers, trees, shrubs, herbaceous perennials, native plants. And I want to talk about the differences here. So let's talk first about annual flowers. Annual flowers throughout the year are at 80% plant factor, 0.8, 80%. So annual, and why would that be? Well, annual flowers have a short lifetime. They're dependent on water for the most part, because that short lifetime has to be, is going to basically be fueled, by water. And so when you're planting annual plants, you need to, you need the plan that those plants are going to require 80% of the water that the ETO plant requires in each month. So again, if our ETO plant requires 10 inches of water in July, our annual flowers in July would require 8 inches of water. Okay, is everybody kind of down on this? I hope. All right. If you look now at ground covers, trees, and shrubs, you're going to see, yeah, hey, guess what? They are basically all the same. 60% of ETO is used for ground covers, trees, and shrubs, pretty much throughout the year. But then you get down to native plants. And what does that mean? So these are plants that are adapted to the particular climate, and in particular are adapted to the hot season of the particular place where you are. So this is, the summer months. They are adapted to, they have adaptations for reducing their water requirement in the summer months. And that makes sense pretty much everywhere that native plants would be like that. So we're not talking about native riparian plants here, right? We're talking about the dryland plants. Wherever you are, native plants are going to require 30% of the water that the ETO is. So again, in July, if 10 inches of water are required by cool season turfgrass, the ETO plant, the native plant would only require 3 inches in the same place. So you see now how the plant factor adjusts ETO. And we then use it to determine how much water a particular plant in a particular landscape, in a particular macroclimate requires. Okay. So again, conceptually, if we want to communicate this to people, this is a kind of valuable way to begin to communicate it. What we are determining here, we just started talking about plant factor, which is this percentage that adjusts ETO. And this chart is showing us that in this particular place, ETO of 45 inches a year, that's what cool season grass needs. The plant factor for that would be 100%, right? It is the ETO plant. But then a moderate water requiring plant would require 40 to 60% of cool season grass, and a low water requiring plant, 10 to 30%, and then a very low water requiring plant, less than 10%. So even though we're using the slide method for our figuring it out, like in the field, or if we're doing a report or whatever, the data is going to be all over the place. We could be reading a grower's guide to plant material, and it will say, this is a low water requiring plant. Well, are you going to, you may remember off the top of your head, oh, it's a tree. Okay. I'm going to apply this percentage to it. Or You may know, oh, this is a native plant. Okay, I'm going to put 30% against it. Or you may say, okay, it's a low water use plant. Okay, I could use between 10 and 30% for my calculation. All right. Any way you come by this plant factor information, the most important thing really is how you use it. And so we are going to use the plant factor to adjust ETO to come up with our very first acronym. I mean, ET is an acronym, plant factor PF is an acronym, but this is the first big one. Plant water requirement, PWR. The plant water requirement is ETO, inches, times the plant factor, percentage. So let's use it very quickly. Let's talk a little bit about how we use ETO, how we determine plant water requirement by doing some exercises. So here's an example where we want to determine the daily plant water requirement. Okay, when you see D in front of plant water requirement, or you see daily in front of it, what do you know you're going to have to do right now? You know you're going to have to divide by the number of days in the period. So you're going to have to look, is my ETO data annual or monthly? And then, adjust accordingly. So in this particular exercise, you are getting both the annual ETO and a July ETO. So you get to kind of practice doing it. It's repetition, but there you have it. So let's just set up the first one, which is figured out here. So for the first one, we're talking about a high water requiring plant. This just happens to be cool season grass, but it's a cool season grass. And I want to know what the daily plant water requirement is for this plant when my annual ETO is 47 inches a year. I am assigning that plant an 80% plant factor. So here's the thing. If you are given data that shows a range, 70 to 90, 40 to 60, 10 to 30, you can just go with the middle of the range. Okay, see, I told you, art and science, right? Just go with the middle of the range. It makes it easy. So in this case, the middle of the range is 80%. I would adjust my ETO of 47 inches. Oh my goodness, I've been talking for an hour. Adjust my ETO for 47 inches, and I divide by 365 because it's an annual ETO. And then if I'm figuring out daily ETO for July, I take my July ETO, I multiply it by 80%, and I divide it by 31 because that's how many days are in July. And that will give me my daily plant water requirement. Remember, there are going to be some plant adaptations that are going to reduce the water requirement. And so you want to kind of keep your eye on that. That's plant factor. That is an ETO adjustment. There's another ETO adjustment that we're going to just talk about a little bit now because irrigation efficiency comes up in a little bit more in the application of water. But truly, if we're just looking at how much water does a plant require in a landscape, yes, it is dependent on the plant, but it's also dependent on the efficiency of the irrigation system. So the way that we determine the efficiency of the irrigation system is essentially by using distribution uniformity. Now, these are two different things. And again, we're getting into acronyms, so just stay calm. Irrigation efficiency is like the giant holistic way of describing how efficient an irrigation system is. And distribution uniformity is a key component of that. In fact, it's kind of the biggest component of irrigation efficiency. And so throughout this course and really throughout, sort of general discussion, these two things are treated as equals. When someone says, I have a distribution uniformity of 50%, that is taken to mean that the irrigation efficiency is 50%. But technically, they're not exactly the same. They are not synonymous with each other. Distribution uniformity is measuring how evenly the water soaks into the ground, how evenly it's applied to the landscape, beneficially applied to the landscape during an irrigation event. So water's being applied. Is it distributed completely uniformly on that landscape? That's distribution uniformity. And you can see that's a really important thing in irrigation efficiency. But irrigation efficiency is the ratio of the irrigation water that is beneficially used, applied to, beneficially used by the landscape to the amount of irrigation water that is applied. So this takes into account other things like, is there overspray? It could be uniformly distributed on the landscape, but then half of the water could be sprayed onto a hardscape nearby. That doesn't affect distribution uniformity, but it affects irrigation efficiency because we're applying water to the landscape, but only half the water is actually getting on the landscape. Okay, so these two things are very, very similar. You cannot have good irrigation efficiency if you do not have a good distribution uniformity. But just because you have good distribution uniformity, it doesn't mean that your irrigation efficiency is going to be good. Now, we use DU and IE, and I'm going to switch to acronyms every now and again. We're going to use those interchangeably in this class, but you understand that they're not exactly the same, right? Okay, and clearly the efficiency of the application of water to the landscape is going to affect how much water the plant requires. One of the challenges that we face is that most people actually apply 2 times the plant water requirement to especially to lawn, to turf grass. And the reason is why? Why do you suppose that is? That if I have 48 inches of water required by my grass, but I'm applying 96 inches to the grass, why do you suppose that is? I want you to think about it for a second. Well, it's mostly because the irrigation, as I said, is applying that water, and not every single drop is getting on the landscape beneficially. So if an irrigation system is 50% efficient, all right, 50% efficient, what does that mean? It means that we are going to have to apply twice as much water onto the landscape to get what the landscape needs. And the way that we figured this out is we divided by 50%. We divided the perfect irrigation system would be theoretically 100% efficient. And we divided by 50%, which is the efficiency that we've measured, to determine that we need to apply twice as much water to the landscape in order to get it, in order to figure out how much water we actually have to apply. So anytime we are talking about irrigation efficiency for the rest of this class in our lives, when we talk about it, we never are multiplying by irrigation efficiency. It's a percentage, but we are dividing by it. And the reason is that we have to adjust our numbers for the fact that we will never have a 100% efficient irrigation system. It will never be perfect. We are always going to have to apply more water to the landscape to get what we need when we use an irrigation system. There's no such thing as 100% efficiency. So if I wanted to know the plant water requirement, given that I had an irrigation system that was 50% efficient, my plant water requirement would be divided by 50%, And if my plant water requirement was 40 inches a year, that means I would divide by 50% and I would know that my new plant water requirement, because I have irrigation, is actually 80 inches a year. Wow. So one of the things that we like to say is that no irrigation is 100% efficient. Think about that for a second. No irrigation is 100% efficient. Take the moment to just do the thought experiment so that you have it down. If we had a drip irrigation system that was 90% distribution uniformity, now remember that in our world, that's a proxy for irrigation efficiency. So if we had a 90% distribution uniformity and we had a plant water requirement of 20 inches a year. Now, by the way, you know that if you have a plant water requirement, that's already been adjusted. That's ETO that's been adjusted by plant factor. So we've already figured all that part out. But we have 20 inches a year and our drip irrigation is 90% efficient. What is my adjusted plant water requirement and how do I get there? Well, I take the 20 inches a year, I divide by 90%. That's my distribution uniformity, irrigation efficiency. And I find out that that this plant now actually requires 22.2 inches of water a year. It requires that because of the irrigation system. When we have a landscape with irrigation, we always require more water than a landscape that doesn't have an irrigation system. Think about that. So there is an exercise in order to determine the plant water requirement that is adjusted by the irrigation system. And essentially, you are taking the plant water requirement for the month of June, in this case, 4.2 inches. And now you're going to adjust it for the irrigation system, and you're going to turn it into daily plant water requirement. You can divide by the number of days before you adjust it, or you can adjust before you divide for the number of days. Either way is fine. I kind of like doing all of my calculations first and then turning it into a daily number. That's just my way of doing it. And if the formulas begin to get a little more complicated, it's easier to do it that way because you're kind of keeping all your units together. So I'm actually going to go out there and recommend that you do your calculations on figuring out the plant water requirement for the month and then divide it by the number of days. But again, everybody's got their own way of approaching it. So in this case, I would take 4.2 inches and I would divide it first by my spray system, which is 50% efficient. And that would tell me that I now need 8.4 inches in the month of June. And then I divide it by 30 to get my daily plant water requirement. Drip irrigation, you're going to do the same thing. You would take the 4.2 inches in June and divide it by 80%. And that's going to tell you you're now adjusted for irrigation plant water requirement, and you divide by 30 in order to get the daily plant water requirement. The formula up here for adjusted daily plant water requirement is doing it slightly different. It's taking the daily ETO. So that, like I said, that's another way that you can do it. You figure out daily ETO, and then you apply the plant factor, and then you divide by irrigation efficiency. Or you take your whole monthly ETO, multiply it by plant factor, divide by irrigation efficiency, and then convert it into days. Either way works. Okay. That ends the plant water requirement section.